The wind off Lake Michigan in February does not just chill the skin, it hunts for the bone. It was 1977, a winter that Chicago would never forget, buried under sheets of gray ice and a silence that felt heavy, almost suffocating. In the Edgewater district, the apartment buildings stood like frozen sentinels against the night sky, their brick facades hiding thousands of lives, thousands of secrets. Among them lived a woman named Teresita Basa. To look at her, you would see nothing that screamed victim. You would see a woman of quiet dignity, 47 years old, a respiratory therapist who spent her days breathing life into the lungs of others at Edgewater Hospital. She was a woman of culture, a woman who had come from a wealthy family in the Philippines to build a life of independence here in the cold heart of America. She was not a woman who courted danger. She played the piano. She taught music. She lived a life of gentle, rhythmic precision. Tonight, the hallway of her building at 2740 North Pine Grove Avenue was dim. The air inside the apartment, Unit 15B, was warm, a sanctuary against the biting frost outside. Teresita was settling in. Imagine the sound of the radiator hissing, the soft hum of the city traffic muffled by the thick walls, the feeling of safety that we all take for granted when we turn the lock on our own front doors. She was alone, or so the world thought. But in the quiet of a single woman's apartment, loneliness is a companion that sits in the corner, watching. Teresita was comfortable with her solitude. She had friends, she was well-liked, respected by her colleagues for her reserved and polite nature. She wasn't the type to open her door to strangers late at night. She wasn't the type to take risks. But evil does not always come knocking with a mask and a weapon. Sometimes, evil wears a familiar face. Sometimes it smiles at you. It stands in the hallway, acting sheepish, perhaps holding a tool bag, offering a favor. The terror of this night, the thing that makes your blood run cold, is not that Teresita was hunted by a monster in the shadows. It is that she likely welcomed the monster in. She let the wolf cross the threshold because the wolf was dressed in the clothing of a friend. The atmosphere in apartment 15B shifted imperceptibly. One moment it was a home. The next it was a cage. Can you feel the tension? The way the air suddenly feels too thick to breathe? There is a specific kind of horror in betrayal. As she moved through her apartment, perhaps offering a drink, perhaps chatting about the day's work at the hospital, the clock was ticking down. Every second was a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass that had already run out. She didn't know it yet. The human mind protects us from the realization of our own mortality. It blinds us to the knife until the blade is already falling. She was surrounded by her things, her music, her jewelry, the small treasures of a life well lived, unaware that these very objects were being calculated, assessed, and priced by the eyes watching her back. The night was deepening outside. The few pedestrians on the street below had their heads down against the wind, hurrying home, blind to the tragedy unfolding several stories up. It is the isolation of the city dweller, surrounded by millions, yet utterly alone in the face of death. Inside those walls, the conversation was ending. The pretense was dropping. The air in the room likely grew charged, static with a sudden, confused fear. Why is he standing like that? Why did his voice change? The moment of realization is the most terrifying moment of a human life. The split second where the brain screams run, but the body is frozen by the sheer impossibility of what is happening. Teresita Basa, the gentle healer, the quiet musician, was about to face a violence so brutal, so senseless, that it would not just end her life, but it would shatter the peace of the dead themselves. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, reaching out for her, as the trust she placed in her visitor curdled into a dark, horrifying regret. The silence of the apartment was about to be broken, not by music, but by the chaotic, desperate struggle for survival. It started with a smell, not the comforting scent of wood smoke or dinner cooking, but something acrid, chemical, and wrong. It was the smell of burning synthetic fabric, of scorching foam, and beneath it, a faint, sickly sweetness that the human brain tries desperately not to identify. It was around 7:30 p.m. Neighbors in the building, like Ruth Loeb, paused in their evening routines, sniffing the air, that primal alarm bell ringing in the back of their minds. Fire in a high-rise is a nightmare scenario. It climbs, it consumes, it traps. The panic began to ripple through the floor, a low-grade frequency of fear. Calls were made. Voices were raised in the hallway. The distant wail of sirens began to bleed into the night, growing louder, cutting through the frozen air of Chicago like a jagged knife. When the Chicago Fire Department arrived, the scene was chaotic, but routine. They were used to this. A cigarette left burning on a sofa, a pot left on the stove. They surged into the building, heavy boots thudding on the stairs, their breath steaming in the cold, carrying hoses and axes, prepared to fight the beast. They reached apartment 15B. The door was breached. A wall of heat and thick, choking smoke rolled out to meet them. Visibility was low. They moved with practiced efficiency, crawling low, searching for the source of the blaze. They found it in the bedroom. A mattress was engulfed in flames, the orange light dancing wildly, casting long, frantic shadows against the walls that looked like writhing demons. They doused the flames. The hiss of water hitting superheated material filled the room, replacing the roar of the fire with a sizzling, dripping silence. The smoke began to clear, drifting lazily toward the ceiling. The firefighters stepped back, wiping sweat and soot from their faces, thinking the job was done. Just another domestic accident. Just another tragedy of carelessness. But as the steam dissipated, the charred remains of the mattress revealed what lay beneath. This was the moment the night broke. This was the moment the routine call became a descent into hell. There was a body. It wasn't just a body caught in a fire. It was a scene of calculated desecration. Teresita Basa lay there, stripped of her dignity, stripped of her clothes. She was completely naked, her small, fragile frame exposed to the ruin of the room. The fire had been set directly on top of her, a clumsy, brutal attempt to erase her, to turn a human being into ash and bone. But the fire had not done its job completely. It had left enough. It had left the truth. As the firefighters looked closer, their stomachs turning, they saw the glint of metal in the center of her chest. A butcher knife. A large, kitchen butcher knife was buried deep in the center of her chest, the handle protruding like a tombstone. The horror of it washed over the room. This was not an accident. This was an execution. Teresita hadn't died from the smoke. She hadn't died from the heat. She had been slaughtered. The realization shifted the energy in the room instantly. The firefighters stopped being rescuers and became witnesses to an atrocity. The air felt heavier, charged with the violence that had occurred just hours before. Someone had stood over her. Someone had driven that knife through her sternum with terrifying force. And then, that same person had piled clothing and the mattress on top of her bleeding body and lit a match. The police were called immediately. The radio chatter changed from structure fire to homicide. Detectives stepped into the apartment, their shoes crunching on wet, soot-covered debris. The smell of the extinguished fire was now mixed with the metallic tang of blood. They looked at the petite woman, her life violently stolen, lying amidst the wreckage of her sanctuary. The contrast was heartbreaking, the violence of the act versus the smallness of the victim. Who would do this? Why? There was no forced entry. The door had been locked. The killer had walked out, locked the door behind him, and left Teresita to burn. The investigation began in the damp, dark ruins of apartment 15B, but the darkness they were staring into was far deeper than just a burnt room. It was the darkness of a human soul capable of absolute cruelty. The silence that follows a murder is not peaceful. It is heavy, a vacuum that demands to be filled with answers. Detectives Joseph Stachula and Lee R. Eplin walked into that vacuum, carrying the weight of the city's justice on their shoulders. They were seasoned Chicago homicide detectives, men who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, but the Basa scene was frustratingly, maddeningly clean in its chaos. The fire had done its work, licking away fingerprints, destroying fibers, washing away the microscopic breadcrumbs that killers leave behind. The water from the fire hoses had done the rest, turning potential evidence into a sodden, useless mush. They stood in the center of the damp, charred apartment, looking for a ghost. The first thing that struck them was the lack of forced entry. The lock wasn't picked. The door wasn't kicked in. Teresita had opened that door. She had disengaged the deadbolt. This wasn't a stranger lurking in the bushes. This was a guest. This detail gnawed at Stachula. It narrowed the suspect pool from everyone in Chicago to people Teresita trusted. But Teresita Basa trusted many people. She was kind, generous, a woman without enemies. Who among her circle of friends, fellow musicians, and hospital colleagues could plunge a knife into her chest and then set her on fire? The discrepancy between the brutality of the crime and the gentleness of the victim was a chasm they couldn't bridge. They scoured the apartment for anything the fire hadn't claimed. Amidst the soot-stained papers and waterlogged personal effects, they found a small note, a scrap of paper that seemed to offer a lifeline. On it, written in Teresita's neat handwriting, were the words, "Get tickets for AS." 2 letters, A and S. The detectives' pulses quickened. A name, a connection. They ran down the list of her acquaintances. They interviewed friends, neighbors, coworkers at Edgewater Hospital. Did she have a boyfriend? A secret lover? A jealous ex? The answers were a monotonous, heartbreaking no. Teresita was a private woman, devoted to her work and her music. There were no scandals, no illicit affairs, no dark secrets. The AS lead dangled in front of them, taunting and elusive. They couldn't attach a face to the initials. Was it a friend? A relative? Or just a random reminder for a mundane errand? The trail, which had sparked with such promise, began to fizzle out. They looked into the robbery angle. Her jewelry box had been rifled through, empty voids staring back where gold and gems used to be. So, was it just a robbery gone wrong? A burglary turned into a panic killing? But why the nudity? The autopsy revealed she hadn't been sexually assaulted. The stripping of her body seemed like a ritual, a bizarre act of humiliation, or a clumsy attempt to stage a rape scene to throw the cops off. It didn't fit the profile of a simple thief. Thieves grab and run. They don't undress the dead and arrange a funeral pyre. Weeks bled into months. The yellow police tape came down. The smell of smoke faded from the hallway of 2740 North Pine Grove Avenue. The file on Teresita Basa's murder moved from the active stack to the side of the desk, and then, inevitably, into the drawer. The cold case drawer. It is the graveyard of justice. It is where victims go when the world runs out of questions. Statula and Eplin hated it. They hated the feeling of a killer walking free, blending back into the crowd, perhaps even working alongside the very people who were grieving Teresita. They had the what and the where and the when, but the who and the why had evaporated like the smoke from the fire. The investigation hit a dead end, a solid brick wall of silence. The city of Chicago moved on, its relentless pace burying the memory of the respiratory therapist under new headlines, new crimes, new tragedies. Teresita Basa was gone, and it seemed that the truth had died with her, buried in a frozen grave, destined to be forgotten. While the file on Teresita Basa gathered dust in a steel cabinet at the police station, life continued elsewhere, oblivious and mundane. In the quiet suburb of Skokie, Illinois, miles away from the crime scene, Dr. Jose Chua and his wife, Remy, were living the American dream. Dr. Chua was a man of science, a surgeon. His world was defined by logic, by anatomy, by the tangible reality of flesh and bone. He fixed what was broken. He trusted what he could see, what he could touch. There was no room in his operating theater for ghosts, for spirits, or for the unexplained. His universe was orderly, sterile, and predictable. Remy Chua, like Teresita, was a respiratory therapist at Edgewater Hospital. They moved in the same circles, walked the same sterile corridors, perhaps exchanged polite nods over patient charts or in the cafeteria line. But they were not close. They were colleagues, connected by their profession and their shared heritage as Filipino immigrants making a life in a new land. Teresita was just a face in the crowd of Remy's life, a tragic story discussed in hushed tones in the break room, a cautionary tale that faded as the weeks went by. To the Chuas, the murder was a distant horror, something that happened to other people, something sad but ultimately unconnected to their safe, comfortable existence in Skokie. But darkness is not bound by geography. It does not respect the sanctity of the suburbs. It began slowly in the Chua household, like a draft in a room with all the windows closed. It wasn't a sudden explosion of terror, but a creeping, insidious unease. A shadow in the corner of the eye, a cold spot in the hallway, the feeling of being watched while washing dishes or reading a book. Remy began to change. It was subtle at first, a distant look in her eyes, a sudden stillness that would descend upon her, as if she were listening to a frequency that no one else could hear. She would lose track of time. She would stare at walls, her expression blank, her breathing shallow. Dr. Chua noticed. How could he not? A surgeon is trained to observe, to spot the smallest deviation from the norm. He saw his wife drifting away, retreating into a place he couldn't follow. He asked her what was wrong. Was it stress? Was it the job? Was it the lingering sadness of Teresita's death casting a pall over the hospital staff? Remy couldn't explain it. She spoke of a heaviness, a feeling of oppression, a sense that she was losing control of her own thoughts. She was frightened. The sanctuary of their home no longer felt safe. It felt occupied. The air in the house grew thick. The ordinary sounds of domestic life, the ticking clock, the settling foundation, began to sound ominous, like the footsteps of an intruder. The logic that Dr. Chua clung to began to fray at the edges. He checked her vitals. He looked for medical explanations. But there is no medical diagnosis for a haunting. There is no prescription for a soul that is being encroached upon. The fear in Remy's eyes was primal, ancient. It was the fear of the prey realizing the predator is already in the room. They were alone in the house, yet the space felt crowded, suffocating. The invisible wall between the living and the dead was thinning in Skokie, and the Chuas were standing right at the fracture point, unaware that the dam was about to break and a torrent of impossible truth was about to wash over them. The surgeon and his wife were about to become players in a drama scripted by the grave itself. It happened on a Tuesday, an evening that should have been forgotten as soon as it passed. The Chuas were in their bedroom. The house settled into the heavy silence of late night. Remy was lying down, perhaps trying to rest after a long shift at the hospital, but sleep was a distant shore she couldn't reach. The room was dim, lit only by the spill of a street lamp through the curtains. Dr. Chua was nearby, reading, the rustle of pages the only sound tethering them to reality. Then, the tether snapped. It began with a gasp, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like someone surfacing from deep water. Dr. Chua looked up, expecting a nightmare, a cramp, something mundane. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. Remy was rigid. Her body was arched on the bed, muscles taut as steel cables, her hands gripping the sheets with white-knuckled ferocity. Her eyes were wide open, staring not at him, not at the ceiling, but at something standing in the shadows of the corner, something that only she could see. Her face was contorted, a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't the face of his wife. It was the face of a stranger witnessing their own execution. Remy. Dr. Chua's voice trembled, a small sound against the sudden enormity of the room. He moved toward her, his medical training kicking in, reaching for her pulse, checking her eyes. But she didn't react to his touch. She was cold, unnaturally cold, like a stone left out in the snow. Her breathing was ragged, shallow gasps that rattled in her chest. She began to mumble, a low, incoherent stream of sound that wasn't quite speech. It was more like a frequency, a vibration coming from deep within her throat. Dr. Chua tried to wake her, shaking her shoulders, calling her name louder now, panic rising in his chest. Remy, wake up. What is happening? But she was gone. The woman on the bed was a vessel, and something else was pouring in. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, the air pressure dropping until his ears popped. A smell drifted up, faint but unmistakable, the smell of stale smoke, of charred fabric. It made no sense. There was no fire in the house. The sensory dissonance was dizzying. Then, Remy's head snapped toward him. The movement was mechanical, jerky, lacking the fluid grace of a living person. Her eyes were different. The pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris, black holes absorbing the light. She looked through him, not at him. Her lips moved, and a sound came out that sent a primal shiver down the surgeon's spine. It wasn't a scream. It was a moan of sorrow so deep, so profound, it felt like the earth itself was weeping. She began to speak, but the cadence was wrong. It was choppy, fearful. "She is here," Remy whispered, her voice strained, practically bleeding with fear. "She is in the room. She wants to tell." The voice cracked. Remy's body began to convulse, not in a seizure, but as if she were fighting a physical battle with an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Dr. Chua watched, helpless, his scientific mind scrambling for a foothold on a cliff face of sheer madness. This was not epilepsy. This was not a stroke. This was an invasion. The fear in the room was palpable, a living thing coiling around them. Dr. Chua felt a presence, a cold spot standing right beside the bed, radiating a sorrow and an anger that made his skin crawl. He realized with a jolt of horror that he was the third person in the room. His wife was the door, and something was knocking, pounding, demanding to be let in. The rational world he had built, the world of scalpels and sutures and diagnosis, shattered into a million pieces on that bedroom floor. He wasn't a doctor anymore. He was just a man in the dark, watching his wife drown in a sea of the supernatural, unable to throw her a line. The descent had begun, and there was no way to stop the fall. The darkness did not recede with the dawn. It simply waited for the sun to set again. The episodes became a terrifying ritual in the Chua household. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a conversation with the dead. In subsequent nights, the entity that had seized Remy Chua's body stopped hiding in the shadows of her mind and stepped into the light of control. The transformation was absolute. When Remy fell into that trance, her facial muscles slackened and then reconfigured, her posture shifted, and the air in the room would drop in temperature until Dr. Chua could see his own breath misting in the dim light. Then, the voice came. It was not Remy's voice. It was not the voice of the woman he had married. It was lower, smoother, carrying a cadence of speech that was entirely foreign to his wife. It spoke in Tagalog, but with a specific, cultured intonation that belonged to the wealthy families of the Philippines, a dialect and manner of speaking that Teresita Basa was known for. Dr. Chua sat by the bed, his hands trembling, a tape recorder running, capturing the impossible. "I am Teresita Basa," the voice said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling calmness that was more terrifying than any scream. Dr. Chua, forcing himself to function through the terror, asked the question that the entire Chicago police force had failed to answer. "Who killed you?" The answer came without hesitation, a name spat out from the void with venom and clarity. Allan Showery. The name hung in the air like a curse. Allan Showery. Dr. Chua knew the name. Showery was an orderly at Edgewater Hospital, a man they saw in the halls pushing carts, a man who smiled and said hello, a man who existed in the periphery of their lives. But the voice wasn't finished. It began to paint a picture of the last moments of Teresita's life, a narrative so detailed, so specific, that it could not be a hallucination. "He came to my apartment," the voice narrated through Remy's lips. "He said he would fix my television. I let him in." The betrayal was palpable in the tone. The spirit detailed the mundane reason. For the visit, a broken TV. It was the Trojan horse. The voice described the moment the pretense dropped, the moment the repairman became the killer. It spoke of the attack, the sudden violence that erupted in the quiet apartment. But it went further. It didn't just give a name and a method, it gave evidence. "He took my jewelry," the voice hissed. "He took my pearl cocktail ring. He took my jade pendant." These were not vague descriptions. These were specific items. Teresita, through the vessel of Remy Chua, was itemizing the loot of her own murder. She described the ring in detail, the setting, the stone. She described the pendant. She told Dr. Chua exactly what Showery had done. "He gave the jewelry to his woman," the voice said. "He gave my things to his girlfriend." The complexity of the information was staggering. How could Remy know about a broken TV? How could she know which specific pieces of jewelry were missing from a crime scene she had never visited? How could she know the name of a man she barely interacted with, linking him to a private visit in Teresita's home? This was knowledge that only two people could possess, the killer and the victim. And one of them was sitting in the room, buried inside his wife's mind. Dr. Chua listened as the voice faded, leaving Remy slumped on the bed, exhausted, with no memory of the words she had just spoken. He looked at the tape recorder, the magnetic ribbon holding the accusation of a ghost. He looked at his wife, who was slowly returning to herself, unaware that she had just become the star witness in a homicide investigation. The skepticism of the surgeon was gone. He was no longer dealing with a medical anomaly. He was holding the key to a murder case, handed to him by the victim herself. The burden of the truth was immense. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he couldn't keep this in the dark. The dead were not resting. They were screaming for justice, and they had chosen him to be their messenger. The burden of the secret was heavier than the dead body itself. Dr. Chua spent the next few days in a state of paralyzed conflict. He was a surgeon, a man of prestige, a pillar of the community. In the medical world, reputation is currency, and sanity is the baseline requirement. How could he possibly walk into a Chicago police station, sit down with hardened homicide detectives, and tell them that his wife was channeling the spirit of a murder victim? It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. It sounded like madness. He could imagine the looks they would exchange, the smirks, the polite nod as they escorted him out, or worse, the suspicion that would turn back onto him. Why do you know so much, doctor? Is the ghost just your guilty conscience speaking? The fear of ridicule was a cold hand around his throat, but the fear of the haunting was stronger. The episodes weren't stopping. The atmosphere in his home was decomposing, and gnawing at the back of his mind was the terrifying possibility that it was all true. If Allan Showery really was a killer, he was walking free, working in the same hospital, smiling at patients, perhaps hunting for his next victim. Could Dr. Chua live with that? Could he sleep at night knowing he held the name of the murderer, but kept it locked in his throat because he was afraid of looking foolish? The moral calculus was brutal. Silence was safe, but silence was complicit. He spoke to Remy. She was terrified, humiliated by the loss of control, but she shared his resolve. They had to end this. They had to purge the house of this shadow. So, with a sense of doom hanging over them, they made the decision. They would go to the police. They would offer themselves up on the altar of public skepticism to deliver the message from the grave. The drive to the Area 6 police headquarters felt like a funeral procession. The building was a fortress of brick and bureaucracy, a place where facts ruled and fantasies were crushed. Walking inside, Dr. Chua felt stripped of his professional armor. He wasn't a doctor here. He was just another citizen with a story, and a crazy one at that. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and weary cynicism. They asked for detectives Statula and Eplin. They waited. The waiting was agony, a slow drip of anxiety. When they were finally seated in the interrogation room, a stark, windowless box designed to break liars, the detectives looked tired. The Basa file was cold. They had moved on to fresh bodies. They looked at the respectable couple sitting across from them, expecting a witness statement they had missed, a forgotten memory. Statula leaned back, pen poised. So, doctor, you have information regarding the Teresita Basa homicide? Dr. Chua took a breath that felt like inhaling broken glass. Yes, he said, his voice steadying. But you are not going to believe the source. He told them. He laid it out, not as a fanatic, but as a clinician reporting symptoms. He described the trances. He described the voice. He told them the name, Allan Showery. He watched the detectives' faces carefully. He saw the flicker of disbelief, The raised eyebrow, the glance between partners that screamed, "We have a nutcase here." It was the reaction he expected. In a room built on evidence, on fingerprints and blood types, "My wife is possessed" is not a lead. It's a punchline. But then, Dr. Chua played his ace. He didn't just give them the ghost story, he gave them the details. "She said he stole a pearl ring," Chua said, leaning forward. "She said he stole a jade pendant. She said he came to fix the TV." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The detectives stopped looking at each other and started looking at him. These were not details that had been released to the press. The missing jewelry was known only to the police and the killer. The TV repair? That was something they hadn't even considered, a missing piece of the timeline. The skepticism didn't vanish. Cops don't believe in ghosts, but it was replaced by a sharp, predatory curiosity. If the Chuas were lying, how did they know about the jewelry? If Dr. Chua was involved, why invent such an insane cover story? Statula put his pen down. The silence stretched, tense and vibrating. He looked at Eplin. They were thinking the same thing. It didn't matter if they believed in spirits. It mattered that the information was good. It mattered that for the first time in months, they had a name. They had a suspect. The impossible tip had landed on their desk, wrapped in the shroud of the supernatural, and despite their better judgment, they had to pull the thread. They had to see where the ghost led. Allan Showery was a man who blended in. He was 32 years old, an orderly at Edgewater Hospital, the kind of person who existed in the background of the medical drama. He pushed gurneys, he delivered meals, he changed sheets. He was a cog in the machine, unnoticed and unremarkable. To the casual observer, he was just a guy trying to make a living. But to detectives Statula and Eplin, he was now the center of the universe. The voice from the grave had painted a target on his back, and they were ready to take aim. They didn't storm in with sirens wailing. That's amateur hour. They approached with the quiet, predatory patience of hunters. They dug into his file first. Showery lived on the 500 block of West Schubert Avenue. He had a record, nothing that screamed homicidal maniac, but enough to show he wasn't a saint. But the most damning connection was the simplest one. He knew Teresita. He worked in the same building. He breathed the same air. The proximity was established. Now they needed the lie. The detectives paid him a visit. It was a routine inquiry, or so they framed it. Just tying up loose ends, checking on everyone who knew the victim. They found Showery to be cooperative, almost too smooth. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He answered their questions with a polite, helpful demeanor that made Statulus skin crawl. Sociopaths are often the nicest people you meet, until they aren't. They sat him down and walked him through the days leading up to the murder. They let him talk, let him spin his narrative, waiting for him to trip over the invisible wire the ghost had strung across his path. Then, Statula dropped the bait. "Mr. Showery, did you ever visit Teresita Basa's apartment? Maybe to help her with something? Like a television?" The air in the room seemed to freeze. It was a specific question, dangerously specific. If Showery was innocent, he would be confused. Why would I fix her TV? If he was guilty, his brain would be scrambling. How do they know? Nobody saw me. Teresita is dead. Showery hesitated. A flicker of something dark passed behind his eyes. Calculation. He admitted it. Yes, he said. He had gone to her apartment that night. He had gone to fix her TV. He claimed he arrived, fixed the set. Teresita paid him, and he left. He was out of there early. He had an alibi for the time of the fire. He was with his girlfriend. It was a plausible story, a solid defense. He admitted to being there, which explained any physical evidence they might find, but he removed himself before the murder. It was the smart lie, but the detectives knew better. The ghost had been specific. He robbed me. They needed the loot. A confession regarding the TV wasn't enough to pin a murder on him. It just placed him at the scene. They needed the smoking gun, or in this case, the shimmering pearl. They left Showery with a handshake and a thank you for your time. But the moment they were out of his sight, the real work began. They turned their attention to the girlfriend. The spirit had said, "He gave my jewelry to his woman." If that jewelry existed, if it was sitting in a jewelry box somewhere in Chicago, it was the nail in Showery's coffin. They tracked down the girlfriend. Her name was Yanka Kamluck. She was another innocent player caught in Showery's web. The detectives approached her carefully. They didn't want to tip off Showery that they were circling closer. They brought her in, away from his influence. They sat her down and asked the question that would decide the fate of the investigation. "Miss Kamluck, did Allan ever give you any gifts recently? Maybe around February? Maybe jewelry?" Yanka looked at them, confused. "Yes," she said. "He gave me a ring. And a pendant." The detectives exchanged a look. The adrenaline hit them like a drug. It was real. The ghost wasn't lying. The impossible tip was solid gold. "Do you have them?" Statula asked, his voice tight. "I have the ring," she said. "But the pendant. I didn't like the setting. I gave it to a cousin to reset." "We need the ring," Eplin said. "We need it now." When Yanka produced the ring, it wasn't just a piece of metal and stone. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. It was a cocktail ring, gold with a pearl. It matched the description given by Teresita's family. It matched the description given by the voice. It was Teresita's ring. Allan Showery had taken a trophy from the woman he butchered and gifted it to his lover as a token of affection. The callousness of the act was breathtaking. He had wrapped a dead woman's possession in romance and handed it over, thinking the fire had destroyed the truth. He was wrong. The fire had only forged the evidence into something harder, something undeniable. The trap was set. Now, they just had to spring it. The ring sat on the metal table in the interrogation room, catching the harsh fluorescent light. It was a small thing, a cocktail ring with a lustrous pearl set in a delicate gold frame. To a pawnbroker, it was worth a few dollars. To Detectives Statula and Eplin, it was priceless. It was the physical manifestation of a ghost's accusation. Teresita's cousin had come in earlier that day, tears streaming down her face, and identified it immediately. "That is Teresita's," she had whispered, touching the cold metal as if it were a holy relic. She wore it all the time. The chain of evidence was complete. The voice from the grave had led them to Yanka. Yanka had led them to the ring, and the ring led straight back to the killer. It was time to bring Allan Showery back. This time, the invitation wasn't polite. It was a demand. Showery walked into the Area 6 headquarters with the same swagger he had shown before, a mask of casual indifference plastered on his face. He believed he was smarter than the cops. He believed he had gotten away with the perfect crime. He had burned the evidence. He had no witnesses, and the only person who could testify against him was dead. He sat in the chair, the metal legs scraping against the linoleum, and looked Statula in the eye. "Is there something else, officers? I've told you everything I know." The room was small, hot, and smelled of nervous sweat. Statula didn't speak at first. He just watched Showery. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until Showery began to fidget, shifting his weight, his eyes darting around the room. It's an old cop trick. Let the silence do the screaming. Then, slowly, Deliberately, Statula reached into his pocket and pulled out the evidence bag. He placed it on the table between them. "Does this look familiar, Allan?" Statula asked, his voice low, almost gentle. Showery looked at the bag. He froze. The blood drained from his face so fast it looked like a curtain falling. He recognized the ring. Of course he did. He had peeled it off the finger of the woman he murdered. He had carried it in his pocket. He had given it to his girlfriend as a token of love. Seeing it there, sealed in plastic, sitting in a police station, was like seeing Teresita Basa herself standing in the corner of the room. I've never seen that before," Showery stammered, his voice cracking. The smooth, confident liar was gone. In his place was a terrified man watching his life disintegrate. "Don't lie to us, Allan." Eplin cut in, leaning forward, invading Showery's personal space. "We spoke to Yanka. She told us you gave it to her. She told us exactly when you gave it to her. Right after Teresita died." Showery tried to rally. He tried to spin a new web. Okay, maybe I bought it. Maybe I bought it from someone on the street. I didn't know it was hers." "Stop," Statula said. The word was a hammer blow. "We know you were there. You admitted to fixing the TV. And we know you didn't leave when you said you did. We know you stayed. We know what you did." The detectives hammered him with facts. They dismantled his timeline minute by minute. They pointed out the inconsistencies in his story about the repair. They brought up the jade pendant, the other piece of jewelry the ghost had mentioned. Showery's eyes widened. How did they know about the pendant? He hadn't told anyone about that. Yanka didn't even have it anymore. The level of detail the police had was impossible unless someone had been watching him. And in a way, someone had. The psychological pressure in the room was immense. Showery was trapped in a box of his own making. The walls were closing in. He looked at the ring, then at the detectives, then at the door that was locked from the outside. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of guilt and fear. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a thief who had panicked, a killer who had been outsmarted by his own victim. He began to sweat profusely. His hands shook. He asked for water. He asked for a cigarette. He was stalling, his mind racing for an exit that didn't exist. But Statula and Eplin were relentless. They kept coming back to the ring. "It puts you in the room, Allan. It puts the knife in your hand. Tell us the truth. Tell us why you did it." They offered him a lifeline, not freedom, but the chance to stop lying, the chance to unburden himself. Showery slumped in his chair. He looked small, defeated. The fight went out of him. He realized that no matter what he said, the ring was an anchor dragging him down. The ghost of Teresita Basa had reached out from the void, pointed a spectral finger right at his chest, and said, "Him." There was no defense against that. The silence in the interrogation room wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. It was waiting for the words that would seal his fate. Showery took a deep, shuddering breath, looked down at his hands, the hands that had held the knife, and began to speak. "I did it," Showery whispered, the words falling from his lips like stones. "I killed her." The confession, when it finally came, was sordid and pathetic. There was no grand motive, no crime of passion, no complex vendetta. It was about money. It was about the banal, ugly greed that rots the human heart. Allan Showery told the detectives that he had gone to Teresita's apartment that night with the intention of robbing her. He was behind on his rent. He had bills to pay. And he knew the quiet, wealthy woman in 15B had nice things. He had fixed the TV. Yes, that was his ticket in. But once the repair was done, the mask slipped. He described turning on her. The moment Teresita realized the man she had welcomed into her home was a threat. He demanded money. She resisted. She was small, but she had the fierce dignity of a woman who had built her own life. Panic set in for Showery. He wasn't a professional hitman. He was a desperate, flailing thief. He grabbed the knife from the kitchen. The struggle was short, brutal, and one-sided. He described the sensation of the blade entering her chest, the horrific silence that followed as she crumpled to the floor. But the horror didn't end with her death. Showery, standing over the woman he had just murdered, decided to cover his tracks in the most grotesque way possible. He explained why he stripped her. It wasn't sexual desire. It was a cold calculation to mislead the police, to make it look like a rape homicide committed by a stranger, a sex maniac. He piled her clothes on top of her. He dragged the mattress over. He lit the match. He watched the flames catch, turning the room into an inferno, believing that the fire would consume his sins. He walked out with her jewelry in his pocket, locking the door on a burning tomb. The trial began in 1979. It was a spectacle. The media dubbed it the Voice from the Grave trial. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the buzzing of reporters and the curious public who wanted to see the man caught by a ghost. But the prosecution, led by skilled attorneys, knew they couldn't put a ghost on the stand. You cannot cross-examine a spirit. Instead, they built a fortress of evidence around the supernatural foundation. They presented the confession. They presented the jewelry, the ring and the pendant that Showery had stolen and gifted to his girlfriend. They presented the timeline. Showery's defense tried to fight back. They tried to argue that the confession was coerced, that the police had invented the story. But they couldn't explain the jewelry. They couldn't explain how the impossible tip from Mrs. Chua had led the police to the exact physical evidence needed to convict him. The jury looked at Showery, the man who had sat in Teresita's home, murdered her for a handful of gems, and then tried to burn her out of existence. They looked at the Chuas, the reluctant messengers who had their lives turned upside down by the dead. The verdict was swift. Guilty. Allan Showery was sentenced to 14 years in prison for the murder of Teresita Basa. It wasn't a life sentence. Justice is rarely perfect, but it was a conviction. He served less than 5 years before being paroled in 1983, a fact that leaves a bitter taste in the mouth of history. But the length of the sentence matters less than the method of the capture. He had committed the perfect crime. He had beaten the police. He had beaten the forensics. He was free, and he would have stayed free if not for the one variable he couldn't control, the will of Teresita Basa herself. As for the Chuas, the haunting stopped the moment the truth was told. The icy drafts, the trances, the terrified nights, they vanished as quickly as they had arrived. Teresita had not come to terrorize them. She had come to deputize them. Once her story was told, once her killer was named, she returned to the silence of the grave. Some skeptics argued later that Remy Chua, who also worked at the hospital, might have subconsciously noticed Showery's behavior or overheard something, and her mind constructed the possession to safely bring the information forward. Perhaps, but Remy knew details about the crime scene, the specific jewelry, the television repair, the nudity, that she could not have possibly known through casual observation. We are left with a story that defies the boundaries of our reality. In the cold concrete jungle of Chicago, where thousands of people die and are forgotten every year, one woman refused to fade away. Teresita Basa reached across the divide between life and death to point a finger at her killer. It serves as a chilling reminder to us all. Secrets are never truly safe. You can burn the evidence, you can wash away the blood, you can lock the door. But the truth has a voice of its own, and sometimes, if the injustice is great enough, that voice will scream from the darkness until it is heard. This is the story of the murder that solved itself. The case is closed, but the question remains, lingering in the air like the scent of smoke. When we turn out the lights and think we are alone, who is watching from the shadows?